The night of December 24, 1811, descends upon the German coast like a veil, too heavy for a Christmas Eve. The river glides slowly, almost motionless in the damp cold of the Louisiana winter. The sparse lights of Creole dwellings extinguished one by one, surrendering the riverbank to a darkness pierced only by the occasional flicker of a patrol lantern. In this still nascent zone of American territory, yet profoundly etched by French and Spanish colonial legacies, silence was never synonymous with peace. It bore the vestiges of an ancient, pervasive unease, which contemporary archives describe as a perpetual state of alarm. Consequently, in New Orleans, a letter was sealed by a hurried hand. William C. Claiborne, governor of the Louisiana Territory since 1804, had just received intelligence of a dangerous rumor circulating among the enslaved people of Saint Jean-Baptiste and St. Charles parishes. Official sources remained nebulous. In his dispatches, Claiborne cited neither names nor specific locations. He spoke simply of a movement among the Negroes, hinting at something grave still. Such phrasing was characteristic of the American administration of the era, perpetually dreading a reprise of the events that had unfolded in Saint-Domingue 2 decades prior. Records from the Bureau of Territorial Affairs reveal that such an alert, however imprecise, sufficed to trigger a mechanism of control. The letter the governor penned before midnight was addressed to an influential German coast planter, a member of those Creole families established there for generations. Its contents, partly preserved in territorial archives, were terse, almost administrative. Claiborne therein urged heightened vigilance, enforced patrols, and particular attention to unusual gatherings. No mention of verified facts, no details regarding the rumor's genesis. What mattered to him was not proof, but possibility. In a slaveholding society where the workforce held in bondage vastly outnumbered the masters, the mere notion of nocturnal coordination sufficed to ignite fear. This bureaucratic scene, as commonplace as it was disquieting, revealed the inherent fragility of a system predicated upon the absolute control of a populace feared, one day or night, to cease its obedience. Newspapers of the era, such as the Louisiana Gazette, regularly featured brief articles on disquieting signs, often penned without attribution. A news clipping from December 1811 mentioned unusual unrest among the enslaved people in the vicinity of Saint-Jean, yet specified no concrete facts. The white residents of the region perused these lines as one might decipher a coded threat. The silence of the enslaved, conversely, was never construed as appeasement, but rather as an omen that something was stirring in the cabins, fields, or pathways bordering the Mississippi. Within the plantations themselves, night advanced with a languid pace. The planters prepared for a sober Christmas, observed with the francophone Catholic rites still prevalent along the river. Yet behind the thick walls of their wooden homes, a tension lingered, discordant with both sacred hymns and the very notion of a moment of peace. Several private correspondences unearthed in the 19th century attested to a growing apprehension over the preceding weeks. Some masters recounted hearing nocturnal footsteps near the outbuildings. Others noted the disappearance of tools, hoses, or minor articles. Nothing conclusive emerged, yet in their minds every detail coalesced into a fragment of the same pervasive threat. The enslaved, for their part, experienced this night in an altogether different manner. Christmas Eve vigils sometimes offered a brief reprieve from labor, a time for clandestine gatherings, for song, for the exchange of news from one plantation to another. Late testimonies from descendants, gathered in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, speak of a blend of hope and circumspection. One could never be certain which words might be overheard, repeated, twisted into evidence. A recurrent word in these narratives was silence. Not the silence of submission, but the one that sheltered, the one that permitted existence amidst constant vigilance. The masters' fear stemmed not from what the enslaved spoke, but from what they might conceive. The system rested upon the premise that no thought of emancipation should ever take root. Yet, the region's history reveals that such thoughts traversed, sometimes as tales of Saint-Domingue, sometimes as tidings from the former French National Assembly, sometimes as familial legends of free ancestors. Judicial archives overflow with trials where the primary accusation was not an act, but a presumed intention. The governor's letter reached the German coast shortly before dawn. It would be read in the morning, then disseminated among influential neighbors, subsequently discussed as an official warning. The text, vague as it was, assumed disproportionate significance in private discussions. It was perceived as confirmation that something was afoot. Planters convened to resolve upon increasing patrols and tightening discipline. These were measures already in practice, yet the rumor furnished them a pretext for further stringency. What strikes one about this Christmas night, upon re-examining the documents, is the sheer disproportion between the incident and its repercussions. An unverified piece of information, relayed without precision, assumed the status of an official document within the dossier of latent tension. Authorities, lacking evidence, filled the void with fear. Masters, devoid of facts, filled the emptiness with suspicion. As for the enslaved, their silence was construed as a harbinger of potential insubordination. Each projected upon the other an intention they could neither verify nor comprehend. Amidst this frozen tableau of live and slumbering plantations, the Christmas night of 1811 bore no semblance of peace. It served as an unseen prelude to one of the greatest slave revolts in United States history. The archives record only the trepidation of some and the reticence of others. Yet already, between these two extremes, the profound schism of a system built upon institutional terror was taking shape. The rumor, on this night, was not merely a disturbing piece of news. It was evidence that the slaveholding ode was, in truth, an inherently precarious one. Christmas Eve on the German coast was no tale of interrupted festivity. It was a tableau where every breath, every step, every withheld word became a constituent part of a dossier no one truly opened, yet which all of society felt pressing upon it. It is within this gloom that the narrative begins. The German coast of 1811 appeared, at first glance, peripheral, almost eased from the grand political map of the burgeoning United States. Yet, upon opening the land registries, probate inventories, and military reports preserved in Louisiana's archives, a wholly different reality emerged. The eastern bank of the Mississippi was a strategic expanse, a vital corridor connecting New Orleans to the interior regions. It was a territory shaped by French and German colonial inheritances, then reshaped by American ambitions after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. A land of formidable plantations, held by a few Creole families established there for generations. Censuses from St. Jean-Baptiste Parish revealed a striking demographic structure. On certain estates, enslaved individuals comprised over 80% of the total population. Masters were few, often bound by marriages, alliances, and debts. Among them, everyone knew everyone. Social ties were so tightly woven that the slightest rumor permeated places of worship, markets, towpaths, and live docks. Judicial records bear witness to a world where white authority rested on a fragile network of mutual trust and collective fear. Marginal notes frequently appear in patrol registers. Increased vigilance, risk of gathering, nighttime visit recommended. These comments indicate that public order here was never robust. The Mississippi, heavy and brown, served as the axis around which everything evolved. Economic relations depended on live transport, sugar, cotton, indigo. Territorial customs registers reveal that the German coast plantations formed one of the region's most lucrative agricultural hubs. But this prosperity was founded upon a system that, even in 1811, harboured the potential for its own collapse. The masters knew this. Private letters discovered in the Rue, Mons, and Deslondes family archives often invoked the concept of a precarious balance. The phrase recurred with insistence, conveying a sense of vulnerability that starkly contrasted with these families' material wealth. The enslaved, great in number, were also more connected than official narratives admitted. Late testimonies, though fragmentary, indicate that communities along the German coast maintained ties with those in New Orleans, Pointe Coupée, and sometimes even with travelers from other southern regions. The circulation of news concerning abolition in Haiti, unrest in the Antilles, or political debates in the eastern part of the country formed an invisible thread linking these plantations to far vaster worlds. Archives show only indirect traces of these exchanges, but they suffice to understand that the enslaved were never isolated, contrary to contemporary accounts. Local legislation, revised after the Louisiana Purchase, sought to contain this circulation of ideas. Rural police laws stipulated that enslaved people should not leave the plantation without a pass, should not carry weapons, and should not gather in numbers. These repeated prohibitions offer a clear indication they were necessary precisely because such practices persisted despite them. American authorities, upon aving in the Aegean, discovered a Siole society, opiating a coding to its own noms. We ancient colonial codes we superimposed upon new fidel egulations. Official legistes sometimes reveal contradictions. A Spanish measure still applied in 1811, an American directive that contradicted it, a French note sibiled in the margin, the imprint of a blended administration. It was within this political mosaic that the German coast unknowingly became a font of tensions. The plantes, though united, we divided on how to manage discipline. Some favoured close surveillance, others severe punishment. Notes deeds show significant variations in labo and conto regimes. The strictest musts sometimes boasted in thy lets of a tuple fee plantation, which paradoxically indicated thy constant dead of the slightest lapse. The territorial Amy, undefunded and despesed, played a seconde rôle. Its epots persevered in militia archives, evil and eagular peasants. Battles we often conducted by the plantes themselves, not by professional soldiers. Officers lamented the scarcity of weapons, hoses, and personnel. This deficit was crucial. It partially explains the scale the January 1811 revolt would assume. But in December, it primarily enforced the notion that the German coast was an unprotected front line. The climate, too, added another layer of tension. Winters on the south bank of the Mississippi, humid, maked by cold winds and long nights. Plantations became silent, spaces the slightest sound resonated. Local newspapers frequently mentioned nocturnal alarms, often without specifics, as if the territory haunted by its own anxiety. These repeated mentions reveal an essential truth. In 1811, fear was not exceptional. It was structural. Into this atmosphere, the Chismus Umo did not fall into a void. It landed in a Aegean Alidi, laden with histories of insubordination, aborted conspiracies, and repeated escape attempts, yea after yea. Judicial ecods form Sanchelas, evil that in 1809 and 1810 severe enslaved individuals had been accused of planning suspicious meetings. None of these cases yielded proof, but these episodes fed the collective memory of the plantes. They formed the psychological backdrop for every new alert. What the archives reveal is a fundamental contradiction. The German coast was prosperous, yet it rested upon a fragile ode. It was monitored, yet insufficiently. It was controlled, yet always on the verge of slipping from the grasp of those who declared themselves its masts. December 24, 1811, did not mark the beginning of this tension, but its point of incandescence. It is in this liminal zone, between apparent stability and latent disode, that the Chismas Umo acquires its full meaning. It exposed the planters' fear, the silent resistance of the enslaved, and the authorities' incapacity to govern a territory where laws were numerous but seldom enforced. The German coast, far from being a mere usual backdrop, was the pulsating heart of a system on the verge of fracturing. Every archive, every handwritten note, every complaint filed in court bears its trace. Thus begins the narrative. In a territory overlooked by the grand narratives of national history, yet whose every silence heralded what was to follow. The German coast of 1811 was not a secondary location. It was a space where, silently, one of the most significant uprisings in the southern United States was being forged. Within the archives of the German coast, rumor seldom appears explicitly. It circulates between the lines, in the silences, in the marginal notes. One discerns it when a planter mentions an inexplicable disturbance, when a militia officer writes of a disquieting movement, or when a notary records the complaint of a planter convinced that illicit conversations transpired in the fields. Nothing is described, nothing is proven, but it is precisely in this absence that rumor takes form. It is born of a void that the slaveholding system could not tolerate. The enslaved, for their part, lived in a world where words had to be meticulously chosen. The slightest exchange could be interpreted as a sign of rebellion. Late testimonies collected under the Federal Writers Project indicate the existence, within black communities, of a subtle culture of oral transmission. Whispered stories, news brought by workers sent from one plantation to another, fragments of information overheard in New Orleans and carried back to the Mississippi's banks. These narratives early centered on conspiracies. They spoke of freedom, of distant events, of daily concerns. But when filtered through a master's ear, their nature transformed. What was hope became a threat. Local newspapers in 1811 amplified this phenomenon. In the Louisiana Gazette, several articles in December vaguely mentioned alarming signals among the enslaved. These texts did not inform. They mirrored white fear and transmuted it into established fact. The editors cited no sources, yet their authority sufficed. A single phrase in a newspaper could become, for an isolated planter, proof that danger was brewing. This dynamic is essential to understanding the Christmas rumor. It was not solely carried by the enslaved. It was produced and reshaped by the masters. On the plantations, masters interpreted every ambiguous behavior as a clue. A poorly latched gate became a signal. A momentary absence from the fields became a prelude to flight. An exchange of glances was construed as a pact. The discipline registers of the St. Charles estates show a notable increase in punishments during the final weeks of 1811. Masters knew not what they feared, but they were convinced something approached. Their logic was circular. If they punished more, it meant they saw more signs, and if they saw more signs, it meant the threat truly existed. Yet, there is an element often overlooked in official accounts: the circulation of rumor among the militiamen themselves. Reports preserved in the territorial militia archives reveal profound anxiety among these men, often young and inexperienced, who patrolled at night, imagining an uprising could erupt at any moment. Some wrote of shadows moving, others mentioned voices heard near the river. These unverified declarations, in turn, fueled the planters' meetings. Rumor fed on those who were meant to contain it. This mechanism was not unique to the German coast. The history of slaveholding colonies demonstrates that rumor served as a central instrument of power. It reinforced the cohesion of the masters, justified the implementation of strict laws, and rationalized preventive violence. In a judge's notes from Saint-Jean parish, one finds this revealing sentence: "A rumor, when persistent, must be regarded as a real sign, even in the absence of facts." This logic transformed suspicion into evidence, and evidence into justification for oppression. For the enslaved, conversely, rumor played a role in survival. It was not the fear of an uprising that animated them, but the fear of being accused of preparing one. In late testimonies, the idea that silence protects frequently appears. There is also mention of a double language. What was spoken among intimates was never what could be overheard by an overseer. The slightest misinterpreted word could lead to a cabin search, a public punishment, or even an individual's disappearance from a plantation's records. This imposed silence created constant psychological tension, rendering rumor even more opaque, and thus more perilous. The Christmas rumor of 1811 spoke not of a precise plan. Archives mention neither date, no place, no name. It seemed to emerge from a confluence of weak signs, amplified by the winter climate, the plantation's isolation, the traumatic memories of Saint-Domingue, and the tales masters claimed to hear in the fields. It was a rumor devoid of specific content, yet possessing immense power. It activated a colonial reflex, to imagine an uprising before it truly existed, and thus to repress it even before it manifested. The most significant transformation occurred when rumor became text. On the night of December 24, Governor Claiborne drafted a letter alerting an influential planter. This administrative act altered the rumor's nature. What had been informal apprehension became a dated, signed, dispatched document. This letter, found in territorial archives, marked a turning point. Rumor became archive. Uncertainty became official recommendation. Suspicion became a political object. From that moment, planters had not merely heard something. They had received an alert from the government. The rumor became a duty of vigilance. Private discussions assumed a grave tone. Patrols were enforced. The enslaved sensed the change. More controls, more suspicion, more questions. One entered a space where fear transmuted into action. It is in this atmosphere, woven from insinuated words, heavy silences, and imprecise documents, that the Christmas rumor assumed its full import. It described nothing, yet it foreshadowed everything. It proved nothing, yet it triggered decisions that, days later, would shape how authorities interpreted the Great Revolt of January. Thus, before the first cry, before the first march, before the first open resistance, there was this rumor. It was the matrix of the narrative the masters would later construct. It was the first signal of a fear that, in late December 1811, enveloped the German coast like a cold, persistent mist. In the documents of the German coast, the figure of the master appears not as an isolated individual, but as a member of a close-knit network, structured by kinship ties, economic alliances, and mutual dependence in the face of a largely predominant enslaved population. Notarized registries from 1810 and 1811 attest to this. Marriages between Creole families, divisions of estates, transfers of land titles created a veritable catalogue of power. The masters, though dispersed along the Mississippi, formed a coherent social bloc, bound by a singular obsession to maintain a dominion they knew to be numerically fragile. The system rested on their capacity to administer fear, to transform every gesture of surveillance into a political act. Rural police laws, revised after Louisiana's integration into the United States, provided a framework for this administration of fear. They demanded that owners control the movements of their enslaved, prohibited gatherings after nightfall, and obligated masters to organize regular patrols. St. Charles Parish records indicate that these rules were applied unevenly. Some masters, confident in their personal authority, barely adhered to them. Others, conversely, interpreted them with almost military zeal. These variations created constant tension. Every home, every field, every row of cane became a space subject to arbitrary surveillance. The Christmas rumor intensified this tension. planters exchanged swift letters, often penned in French, containing expressions such as "be aware," "prepare yourselves," "enforce precautions." A correspondence preserved in the Deslondes family archives describes an atmosphere heavy and penetrating, in which masters believed they perceived signs we do not yet clearly see. This sentence, written in December 1811, perfectly illustrates the psychological state of the ruling class. Fear became a filter that distorted reality. Every incident was interpreted as a warning, every silence as a threat. Mastes sometimes convened at one another's homes to discuss the latest patolls or observations made by overseas. The minutes of these gatherings were not officially encoded, but their existence is subtly revealed in correspondences. "Last night, we gathered at Mont's, wrote one plant." The exact content of these debates eludes us, but the consequences are visible in disciplinae egistes. In the days following the Christmas Umo, punishments escalated: whips, shackles, solitary confinements. The violence is not described in detail in the archives, but it emerges as a tool for the accession of authority. What is striking upon reading these documents is the manner in which mastes justified this violence. They spoke of prevention, security, the duty to protect the white community. They presented themselves as guardians of a threatened ode, even though that ode was predicated upon systematic exploitation. This logic appears in a patol epo from Saint-Jean-Pays, dated December 27, 1811. "We deemed it necessary to severely correct an individual whose conduct could endanger the tranquility of the estate. No details are provided. The mere act of endangering sufficed to legitimize the act." In reality, mastes administered not only fear, but also ignorance. They chose what they wished to see, and refused to question anything that might undermine their conviction of being at the center of a natural ode. Archives show they sought no understanding of the deep causes of tensions, working conditions, family separations, past violence. Everything was reduced to the idea of a conspiracy, isk. In their letters, Mastes Ailey spoke of enslaved people as individuals. They considered them as elements of a system, capable of menace but incapable of possessing a history or suffering. This denial is one of the keys to the mechanics of power. Overseas, often from modest backgrounds, played a crucial role in this structure. They were the eyes of the mast, but also the fist to sense the system's instability. Many left traces of personal anxiety in their notes: fear of being alone against a group of enslaved people, fear of misinterpreting a sign, fear of being held responsible for an incident. Their intermediate position seated a palpable psychological tension. They had to prove their loyalty to the planters while dreading the consequences of the slightest EO. Their efforts, more than any author document, reveal the anxious and unstable nature of white domination. This administration of fear also manifested in time management. Masters meticulously organized work, meal, and pay schedules. Any deviation was monitored. A note found in Page Archives indicates that some planters advanced curfew aft the Christmas Umo, fearing that night might facilitate clandestine meetings. This control of time was a form of power as significant as the control of bodies. It transformed the night into a suspicious space. A territory we owed had to be exited every evening. Within this sombre tableau, however, there exists an almost invisible yet essential element. The master's fear was never fully articulated. It appeared in filigree, in hesitations, in contradictory codes, in complaints filed in court for potential insubordination. This fear was not merely the dread of a revolt. It was the diffuse awareness that the system they governed rested on profound injustice, which might one day turn against them. The planters did not state it, but their actions revealed it. Thus, In the days preceding the January revolt, the German coast became a theatre of perpetual suspicion. Masters administered control with increasing intensity, convinced that their authority required enforcement. Archives reveal a world where fear circulated as much as codes, where violence is a daily language, where every gesture aimed to protect an order on the verge of fracturing. It was in this heavy, tense climate that the Christmas rumour found its true dimension, that of a catalyst revealing a system poised to collapse. In official archives, the enslaved appear as subjects. They are objects of property, numbers in inventories, anonymous silhouettes in disciplinary registers. Yet, upon dwelling on late testimonies, orally transmitted songs, and narratives collected more than a century afterward, another world emerges. That of nocturnal lives, discreet vigils, whispered words between rows of cane, connections forged despite prohibition. This world is almost never inscribed in administrative ink. It survives in memories, silences, and fragments. In December 1811, the lives of the enslaved on the German coast were dictated by winter. Days were short. The labor of cutting and grinding sugar remained intense, but masters sometimes tolerated moments of rest at dusk. Late testimonies evoke vigils around small fires, songs in Creole or broken English, Catholic prayers mingled with West African practices. These moments were never innocent. They were watched from afar, interrupted at the slightest suspicion, yet they persisted because they allowed black communities to breathe, to exist, to share stories that shaped their world. The circulation of news between plantations played a central role in this nocturnal life. Enslaved individuals tasked with fetching wood, piloting boats, or assisting in trade exchanges brought information from New Orleans or other urban segments. They spoke of what they had heard: revolts in the Caribbean, rumors of abolition in certain northern states, political conflicts in Washington. For masters, these circulations were threats. For the enslaved, they were signs of hope, proof that the world was vaster than the fields where they toiled. Judicial archives, however, reveal that these conversations were forbidden. A complaint filed in 1810 indicates that a group of enslaved people in St. Jean Parish was accused of exchanging seditious remarks. No details are given, but the mere act of speaking together at night sufficed to create an offence. The silence imposed by masters was therefore not merely a tool of discipline, it was a legal framework. The law prohibited anything that might allow for organization, collective memory, or even the simple expression of shared hope. Nevertheless, despite the risks, the enslaved continued to gather discreetly. Some late testimonies mention meetings near the river, in areas where patrols passed less frequently. They would pay. Sing, O simply speak without immediate fear of being overhead. These accounts never speak of conspiracy. They speak of survival, solidarity, of that fundamental human need to ut what the day forbade. Christmas Eve, in particular, carried symbolic weight. Masters celebrated the peace of the season, but foe the enslaved. It was a time when memories of family, often scattered by sales, became more painful. In contemporary newspapers, the enslaved were depicted as silent, passive figures, dangerous if they spoke. This image was a political construct. It masked the itchness of the clandestine networks, founded on a culture transmitted from generation to generation. Seoli songs, for instance, sometimes contained allusions to freedom, concealed behind religious metaphors. Masters, unable to grasp the linguistic nuances, saw only harmless songs, but black communities found in them a symbolic refuge, a space where speech could exist in a coded form. Silence was thus not merely a constant, it was a strategy. It protected essential conversations and avoided drawing attention. This silence is evident in the archives. Few coded complaints for open rebellion, many moe for suspicious dimiano, insolent gaze, unusual gathering. The enslaved knew that words, even innocently spoken, could be twisted into accusation. They leaned to communicate differently, to transmit, though gestures, songs, glances. This fragile mode of communication, made so by surveillance, paradoxically enforced the cohesion. The Christmas Umo was perceived very differently by the two groups. Maste saw in it a sign of imminent danger. The enslaved sensed the atmosphere shifting, but what they most dreaded was the planters' action. They knew that a Umo, however unfounded, could lead to sieges, interrogations, punishments. In some plantations, overseas tightened discipline, even before the governor's letter arrived. This seated a palpable tension. The enslaved did not always understand what had triggered this sudden mistrust, but they bore its consequences. In this climate of uncertainty, the night of December 24 became a fragile space. Vigils wee slow, songs soft, conversations briefer. Some feared that the slightest outing would be interpreted as a sign of insubordination. Families gathered in cabins, illuminated by a candle, o'er the heath's glow. Archives do not describe these scenes, but old testimonies offer glimpses, lullabies, plays, stories told to calm children. Nothing resembled the theatre the masters imagined. Everything resembled a humanity striving to survive imposed fear. This contrast between the master's perception and the enslaved's lived reality is at the heart of the story. Owners projected onto the subjugated population an intention it had not expressed. The enslaved, for their part, had to calculate every gesture, every word, to avoid being accused of a plot they were not preparing. This asymmetry transformed humor into an instrument of total surveillance. Thus, in the nights preceding the Great Revolt of January 1811, the German coast was traversed by two opposing silences: the anxious silence of the masters and the necessary silence of the enslaved. One fueled suspicion, the other protected life. These two silences, superimposed, created ground where the slightest speak could become interpretation, then suspicion, then sanction. It is in this profound tension that the Christmas humor took out. It revealed no plot. It revealed a system where speech was dangerous, where control was constant, where hope circulated in secret. A world where archives leave many blanks, but where stifled voices still speak, silently, though the fragments that remain to us. Within the official archives of the territorial Louisiana, the figure of William C. Claiborne emerges, though a mass of correspondences penned with a nervous, at times hesitant, yet always preoccupied hand by the maintenance of order. Governor since 1804, he still bore the marks of a mandate characterized by uncertainty, tensions with Francophone Creole elites, lack of military resources, a vast and poorly controlled territory. His correspondence from late 1811 reveals a man at the center of a system he imperfectly understood, tasked with upholding a peace he knew to be fragile. The words he chose, often cautious, sometimes vague, paint a precise portrait of his state of mind. That of an anxious administrator, aware that the slightest incident could escalate into crisis. In a letter preserved in the territorial archives and dated December 23, 1811, Claiborne alludes to certain humors circulating among the enslaved people of the German coast. He specifies not the origin of these humors, writing only that they are sufficient to alarm the inhabitants and that increased vigilance is necessary. This lack of precision is no accident. It reflects the absence of reliable intelligence. American authorities, recently established in this former French and Spanish colony, did not possess an effective network of spies or informants within the black populations. Claiborne, therefore, had to content himself with what he termed signs impressions reported by planters, suppositions transmuted into warnings. This inability to obtain solid intelligence created a particular tension in his governance. Claiborne had to respond to the master's fear, while simultaneously avoiding widespread panic. His letters show him constantly striving to maintain this unstable equilibrium. The tone of his messages wavered between reassuring the planters and a keen awareness that the situation could slip beyond his grasp. In another letter dispatched to a militia officer, he wrote, "I urge the utmost prudence." Recent events in other regions demonstrate that tranquility can conceal imminent dangers. He cited no specific event. But this phasing reveals how deeply the shadow of the Saint-Domingue evolution continued to haunt minds. The masters often interpreted these letters as proof that the government possessed more information than it cared to disclose. This interpretation was erroneous, yet it fueled the spiral of fear. Claiborne, for his part, knew his messages would be read beyond their intended recipients. He knew that every recommendation for caution could be interpreted as confirmation of a conspiracy. He therefore attempted to remain measured, but archives show him to be profoundly anxious himself. In a draft letter, crossed out and never sent, one can read, "I cannot disregard the possibility that certain agitations may lead to violent acts." The words agitations and possibility are encircled with multiple strokes, as if Claiborne hesitated between minimizing and acknowledging the threat. This administrative hesitation occurred within a context where the territorial government lacked resources. Military reports show that the local militia was dispersed, ill-equipped, and at times reluctant to obey federal orders. Claiborne had to rely on the planters themselves to maintain order, asking them to organize patrols, monitor movements, and report any suspicious behavior. This reliance on private militias was not a political choice. It was a direct consequence of the absence of professional forces, but it also reinforced the power of the masters, who could interpret the government's directives according to their own interests, often by tightening discipline. Archives reveal that Claiborne endeavored to maintain moral control of the situation. In several letters, he insisted on the necessity of adhering to laws and refraining from excessive punishment without sufficient proof. This recommendation, however, had almost no effect. Masters viewed the government's prudence as a sign of weakness. Some even reproached him for failing to comprehend local realities. In a planter's response letter preserved in family archives, one can read, "You are not here at night. You do not understand what we know." This explicit tone articulated a profound schism. For the planters, the territorial government was merely a distant intermediary whose authority remained fragile. What Claiborne understood perfectly, however, was that the Christmas rumor could have dire consequences. He foresaw the danger not only of an uprising, but also of a disproportionate reaction from the masters. In an internal note to his secretary, he wrote that excessive fear can lead to regrettable acts that will worsen the situation. This phrase, as in official documents of the era, indicates that Claiborne dreaded white panic as much as black resistance. He knew that the territory's equilibrium rested on restraint, a restraint that the ensuing weeks would violently contradict. On the night of December 24, Claiborne possessed neither the means nor the information necessary to assess the validity of the rumors. What he held were fragmented clues, reports from nervous militiamen, letters from frightened masters. Under these conditions, anxiety became his primary tool. He issued his warnings not out of certainty, but out of precaution. This precaution, paradoxically, sufficed to lend the Union an administrative existence, to bestow upon it an official weight it had not previously possessed. Thus, the governor's apprehension became a central exhibit in the December 1811 Christmas dossier. It revealed a weak state, a hesitant power, an administration attempting to contend with a slaveholding society it did not fully control. Claiborne's voice, audible today in his preserved letters, is neither that of an absolute master nor that of a reformer. It is that of a man placed amidst an unstable system, charged with upholding an order he knew to be founded on violence, silence, and uncertainty. The union, upon reaching his desk, became a political object. Upon leaving his desk, it became an instruction. Between these two gestures, fear escalated and inscribed itself into history. And it is there, in this grey zone of territorial administration, that the fracture, which would erupt into the open on the German coast days later, was heralded. In the military archives of the Louisiana Territory, local militias emerge as a force both indispensable and profoundly unstable. They bore no resemblance to a regular army. These were improvised groups of young planters, overseers, neighbors summoned to assemble to maintain public tranquility. Their equipment was disparate. Rifles inherited from the Spanish period used sabers, a few farm horses. Their training was minimal, yet it was to them that authorities and planters appealed whenever a rumor circulated, whenever a suspicious sound disturbed the night. On the German coast, in December 1811, these militias became the primary bulwark against a threat no one clearly named. Reports preserved in the St. Jean-Baptiste militia archives show a notable increase in nocturnal patrols during the week preceding Christmas. Officers noted unusual movements, aborted encounters, noises in the fields. Nothing was precisely described. Each note seemed to be the trace of an apprehension rather than a concrete fact. The terms employed were vague, repetitive, sometimes identical from one report to another, as if the militiamen, finding nothing tangible, contented themselves with recording the same impressions day after day. These documents illustrate how fear transmutes into administrative routine. The composition of these patrols partly explains this imprecision. Militiamen were neither seasoned soldiers nor trained police officers. Many were young men, some barely of age, who had never faced an organized movement of enslaved people. They ventured out at night by obligation, not conviction. Their private letters, discovered in a few family archives, reveal palpable nervousness. Fear of encountering an armed group, fear of being attacked, fear of misinterpreting a situation. In one such letter, a young militiaman wrote to his brother, "We march in the dark as if searching for something we hope not to find." This sentence encapsulates the collective psychosis, patrolling not to supervise, but to ward off an invisible threat. The militiamen's fear was not merely linked to the possibility of revolt. It also stemmed from the awareness that numerical superiority lay with the enslaved. On certain estates, 10 to 15 white individuals had to oversee more than 100 men, women, and children. Militiamen knew that, confronted with a coordinated movement, they would be overwhelmed. This reality is barely mentioned in official documents, but it surfaces in the most candid reports. An anonymous officer wrote, "If an uprising occurs, we can only slow the catastrophe." This word, catastrophe, occurs frequently. It expresses a diffuse conviction. The colonial order held only by the habit of obedience, not by actual force. Nevertheless, the militias played a central role in consolidating this obedience. They were to inspect cabins, monitor movements, and enforce curfew. These tasks often led to abuses, barely encoded in the archives. Militiamen, in their quest for authority, multiplied searches, interrogated enslaved people without cause, and used force to obtain information. Some reports mention necessary interventions or administered corrections. Although the terms are euphemistic, they testify to daily violence, regarded as a mere tool of control. The Christmas rumor amplified this violence. Militiamen received orders to intensify their rounds. Some spent several consecutive nights without rest. Exhaustion heightened nervousness. Minor incidents became signs. A dog barking too long, a door slamming in the wind, a fire lit in a cabin despite the late hour. Everything could be interpreted as a prelude to rebellion. Reports are filled with these anecdotal observations, transformed by fear into elements of proof. Confusion grew because the militias lacked a clear chain of command. Orders originated sometimes from Governor Claiborne, sometimes from parish judges, sometimes from local planters. Instructions contradicted one another. Militiamen did not always know whom to obey. Some patrols crossed paths without recognizing each other. In a report dated December 26, an officer noted, "We encountered a group of armed men near the river. We believed them to be runaway slaves. It was merely another patrol." This episode reveals the anarchy of an improvised security system. For the enslaved, these intensified patrols transformed the night into hostile territory. Vigils became more discreet. Movements, already risky in normal times, became almost impossible. Late testimonies speak of sudden searches, intrusions into cabins, questions asked without reason. The enslaved understood that the masters were not seeking proof. They were seeking to confirm a fear. This created an atmosphere where the slightest word could be used against them, where the fear of the white population became a more immediate threat than the rumor itself. The role of the militias in this pre-insurrectionary period was not solely operational. It was psychological. By patrolling every night, by raising the constant possibility of danger, they enforced the perception of an omnipresent threat. They contributed to transforming rumor into reality. Their presence made palpable the idea that an uprising could erupt, even if nothing clearly indicated it. Fear became self-perpetuating, circulating among masters, militiamen, and authorities, strengthening with each report. Archives show that Claiborne received several of these reports without being able to verify them. He had no means to calm the situation, much less to clarify it. The militias, left to their own devices, became a mirror of regional anxieties. They did not detect the coming revolt. They anticipated a generalized danger and projected it onto every gesture, every sound, every breath in the night of the German coast. Thus, in December 1811, the militias were not merely a tool of public order. They were the product of a social system founded on fear and domination, and they became its principal vector. Their improvisation, their anxiety, their partial incompetence revealed the fragility of white power. The rumor transformed them into actors in a collective tension that, days later, would explode beyond their control. In the months preceding the January 1811 revolt, judicial archives and parish registries reveal a series of minor events, often seemingly trivial, yet which acquire particular significance when re-examined through the lens of the Christmas rumor. These were isolated fires in tool sheds, disappearances of hunting weapons, nocturnal escapes of a few individuals, complaints filed for insolent behavior. None of these facts, taken separately, constituted proof of conspiracy, but in a society governed by suspicion, they became elements of a narrative that unfolded over the days. The German coast, in late 1811, was a territory where every gesture, every absence, every silence could be interpreted as a sign. Fires were the first elements to appear in the documents. In St. Charles Parish, a report dated October 1811 mentions a sudden fire in a cane warehouse. The report speaks of an accident, but adds that some inhabitants suspect intent. No witness confirmed this hypothesis. Yet, in a private letter preserved in the Mont's family archives, a planter wrote, "We saw yesterday yet another warning of what might soon befall us. The boundary between accident and signal blurred. Fire became a metaphor, read as a message, even if it may have been merely a domestic incident. Escapes, too, took on a new dimension. Records from the New Orleans prison show that several runaway enslaved individuals were apprehended between November and December 1811. Some hailed from the German coast. The reports indicate varied motives: fear of punishment, flight to reunite with a family member, attempt to reach a swamp to survive as free people. But for the masters, these escapes were not individual acts. They were interpreted as fragments of a collective movement. The idea that these fugitives might be bearers of news or conduits for clandestine communication became a recurring theme in private correspondences. This phenomenon intensified as Christmas approached. A patrol report dated December 20th mentions unusual unrest in certain estates, although the document provides no details. The expression unusual unrest is telling. It conveyed a diffuse, unverified feeling, yet one sufficient to strengthen surveillance measures. Masters did not rely on facts. They relied on impressions. In a slaveholding system where the enslaved were rarely permitted to speak, impressions became truths. Silences, above all, played a central role in the master's interpretations. An overseer reported that some enslaved individuals spoke less than usual. This remark, though innocuous, was noted in a register. Another patrol reported that evening songs had ceased for 2 days. The masters read threat into this. They saw it as a sign of conspiracy, whereas for the enslaved, this silence could signify something entirely different: fatigue, prudence, fear of increased repression prompted by the rumors. Silence became an interpretive zone where the intentions of some were projected by the anxieties of others. Local newspapers contributed to this atmosphere of suspicion. In a December 1811 article, the Louisiana Gazette mentioned a state of incomprehensible agitation among certain plantations. No examples were given, but the mere act of inscribing these words into the public sphere reinforced the perception of generalized danger. The newspaper spoke of agitation, the masters read insurrection. The ambiguity of language became an instrument of social control. The lack of precision allowed for all interpretations. Judicial archives also show the appearance of complaints for menacing glances or subversive attitudes. These descriptions, extremely subjective, attest to a psychological state where masters sought signs in bodily expressions, in gestures, in the posture of the enslaved. A gaze held a few seconds too long can become a motive for punishment. A lack of salutation can be considered a provocation. These interpretations reveal the fragility of a system that possessed no certainty, only impressions transmuted into decisions. This paranoid reading of signs fed on the master's collective memory. Many had grown up with tales of the Saint-Domingue evolution, whose echoes had spread throughout the slaveholding world. These fragmented and distorted narratives created an imaginary where every fire recalled the first flames of the Haitian revolt, where every escape recalled strategies of resistance. Masters projected this imaginary onto the German coast, even if the context is different, even if no concrete sign indicated an imminent revolt. In this climate of tension, some enslaved individuals deliberately used ambiguity as a strategy. Late testimonies suggest that some left deceptive traces to divert overseers' attention or to protect more important conversations taking place elsewhere. Others amplified or minimized certain behaviors to avoid excessive surveillance. These gestures, almost invisible in the archives, show that resistance took subtle forms, adapted to a system where every word could cost a life. As signs accumulated in the masters' minds, the rumors dossier fed upon itself. It was not facts that constructed the idea of an imminent revolt. It was the interpretation of facts. It was fear that transformed accident into signal, escape into conspiracy, silence into message. The archives of the German coast bear witness to this transformation. Documents from December 1811 become short, vague, more repetitive. They do not describe reality. They describe how the masters perceived it, and above all, how they dreaded it. Thus, days before the Great Insurrection, the German coast was already a territory laden with meaning, where every daily gesture was read as an omen. The waning signs may not have been indicators of a revolt. They were indicators of a society living in fear of its own system, a society that, unable to comprehend what was truly transpiring in the cabins and fields, filled the blanks with the imaginary of menace. And it is in these blanks, these silences, these contradictory interpretations, that, though no one could yet say it, the explosion of January 1811 was being prepared. The night of December 24, 1811, settled upon the German coast with a silent gravity. Nothing outwardly distinguished this Christmas Eve from preceding ones. Plantations darkened one by one, religious songs faded behind the thick walls of Creole homes. The river continued its slow, obscure journey. Yet, in administrative archives, this night marked a rupture. It was the moment when rumour ceased to be a murmur and became a document. This shift, subtle yet decisive, transformed diffuse apprehension into an official dossier, an element inscribed in the registries of territorial power. The letter dispatched by Governor Claiborne the day before, mentioning a suspicious movement among the enslaved, reached the German coast as the first vigils drew to a close. The dispatch was opened, read, then circulated among several influential planters. This letter was terse, imprecise, almost bureaucratic, but the masters perceived not a cautious recommendation. They read in it confirmation of a threat. This change in interpretation was crucial. The one, hitherto unanchored, gained new weight because it was now imprinted by the ink of an official representative. It became a text, an object that could be held, read, cited, transmitted. Planters then began to record their own observations. In the following days, notes dated to this night are found in several family archives, songs interrupted earlier than usual, group cited behind cabins, unidentified, prolonged silence after curfew. These notes were not evidence. They were fragments of a collective anxiety seeking a language, and, nourished by the letter of the government, they became the raw material for an administrative narrative, a private apprehension transmuted into an element of public record. Patrol reports drafted on Christmas night reflected the same mechanism. One mentions having seen shadows moving between the rows of cane. Another notes a distant fire whose source was unidentified. These descriptions are vague, but their very existence shows that militiamen were now seeking to document what they believed they perceived. They did not see a conspiracy. They saw the possibility of a conspiracy, and this possibility sufficed. Military language seized upon ambiguity, transforming it into an indicator. Fear became a working method. In the enslaved people's cabins, the night was experienced differently. Late testimonies suggest that many knew nothing of the government's letter. They sensed only the crispation of the masters, the more frequent patrols, the more insistent gazes of the overseers. Some noted that evening songs were cut short, out of prudence. Others recounted that families retired early to avoid attracting attention. No one spoke of insurrection aloud. Silence was protection. But this silence, interpreted though white fears, became in reports additional proof that something was being prepared. Thus formed a strange and tragic loop. The enslaved fell silent to avoid punishment. The masters interpreted this silence as a sign of rebellion. The militiamen recorded it in their reports, and the one strengthened with each turn of this cycle. No new facts appeared in the archives from this night. What changed was how facts were read, recorded, classified. Insecurity became structural, and this structure was now written. The wealthy planters organized impromptu meetings at one another's homes. The minutes of these gatherings were not officially encoded, but traces appear in letters sent in the following days. One reads phrases such as, "We must stand ready." The situation requires firm discipline. The signs are multiplying. No details confirmed these impressions. The very use of the word signs shows that rational analysis had been replaced by a symbolic reading of daily life. Night was no longer a space for rest. It became a text. In some cases, masters drafted internal reports for their own family archives. These documents are but significant, consisted of short paragraphs describing the attitude of the enslaved during the hours preceding Christmas. They mentioned, for example, a man seen near a shed, a woman speaking briefly to a neighbor, a child staying too long from the hearth. These innocuous observations were frozen by inscription. Once encoded, they became elements of an imaginary dossier, that of a presumed insurrection. Judicial archives also show that some masters filed complaints the day after Christmas. These complaints were vague: suspicious behavior, worrying movements, hostile attitude. They contained no concrete acts, but they entered official registers, reinforcing the idea that an exceptional situation was unfolding. Colonial justice, without investigation, encoded fear as fact. The dossier grew heavier. For his part, Claiborne received contradictory reports. Some officers downplayed the situation, others exaggerated it. But the governor knew that territorial administration rested on the credibility of order. He could not ignore the complaints, nor could he dispatch troops that did not exist. So, he sent new letters, requesting prudence and enforced surveillance. These words, repeated, in turn fed the dossier, already forming in the field. This mechanism transformed the night of December 24 into a moment when the slaveholding system revealed itself. Rumor became archive, apprehension became protocol, silence became evidence. It is not the announcement of a revolt that gives this night its importance, but the way white fear organized itself into an administrative structure. On this winter night, it was not the enslaved who prepared an uprising. It was the masters who prepared an interpretation. December 24, 1811, is thus less a night of conspiracy than a night of bureaucratic construction. The dossier of the Christmas rumor is not a narrative of events, but a narrative of emotions transmuted into documents. And it is from this dossier, already rich with silences, suspicions, and ambiguous notes, that authorities would interpret, days late, the Great Revolt of January. Christmas night produced nothing, but it encoded everything. On the morning of January 8, 1811, the German coast awoke to a silence that was not unusual. Nothing in the previous day's records signaled an imminent uprising. Yet, hours late, the first news began to circulate among the St. Charles estates. A group of armed, enslaved people was marching towards New Orleans, led by several men known for their intelligence, determination, and silent influence within black communities. This moment, fragmentarily described in the archives, marks the transformation of the Christmas rumor into a real event. The uprising erupted, not as the execution of a long-detected plan, but as an action the masters had failed to comprehend, despite their own fears. Official newspapers, written days after the events, described a sudden and violent insurrection, yet they failed to mention the causes. In military reports, one reads, "The enslaved rose without warning." This phrase is revealing. It shows that authorities refused to acknowledge the possibility of a project matured in silence. However, the initial testimonies of the masters themselves contradict this narrative. Several claim to have noticed, in the preceding weeks, nocturnal gatherings, discreet movements, disappeared tools. These elements, which they had interpreted as signs, suddenly appeared as fragments of a real preparation, but in their archives, the transition between these signs and the event remains blurred. The narrative of the uprising was reconstructed after the fact. The movement's leaders, of whom Charles Deslondes is one of the most cited figures in expressive documents, operated in a context where surveillance was omnipresent. Their organization, therefore, had to remain invisible. Sources provide no details on preparatory discussions, but the mere fact that several plantations participated simultaneously indicates complex coordination. This coordination appears nowhere in the master's registers. It is discernible in the absent spaces of the archive, in those silences that authorities mistook for submission. The uprising was not born of a rumor. It advanced in a controlled silence, that of the enslaved who knew that every word could cost a life. The white response, for its part, was immediate. The militias, already nervous since the Christmas rumor, hastily regrouped. Government officials received the first alerts and ordered general mobilization, but documents show that this mobilization remained disorganized. Militia companies moved without clear coordination, guided by messages transmitted from plantation to plantation. Military reports drafted after the clashes describe rapid pursuits, dispersed engagements, but they primarily reveal an imbalance. The enslaved advanced with a vision, the militias reacted with panic. Official accounts insist on the violence of the insurgents, but offer almost no detail on their actions. They mention burned houses, killed owners, but the descriptions are systematically amplified by the language of fear. Conversely, later testimonies suggest that the uprising sought above all to advance, to gather forces, to reach the city where the insurgents perhaps hoped to negotiate some form of freedom. This contrast between white archives and black traces constitutes one of the major historical challenges. The reality of the intention remains obscure because those who carried it left no text, only expressed acts. In the hours that followed, repression formalized. Militias encircled the groups of enslaved people, dispersed them, pursued them through the dense fields, swamps, and narrow paths along the Mississippi. Military reports evoke a return to order, but they mention neither the bodies left on the ground, nor the wounded, nor the separated families. They speak of neutralization. This technocratic word, inscribed in the archives, masks physical violence. It eases suffering and transforms the dead into elements of an inventory. The official chronology of the uprising was reconstituted after the fact. Masters insisted on its suddenness, judges on its gravity, journalists on its horror. But none of these documents mentioned the system's responsibility. None questioned the direct link between working conditions, surveillance, preventive violence, and the January explosion. The Christmas rumor, present in administrative archives, became in these accounts a kind of fulfilled prophecy. This narrative shift served to legitimize repression. What was a fear without proof became, after the events, proof that the fear was founded. The transformation of rumor into justification appears clearly in newspapers published in the following days. The Louisiana Gazette wrote that warnings had been brought to the attention of authorities, that signs had heralded the manifestation of the revolt. This writing eased the vague and uncertain nature of the December documents. It reconstructed a coherence that never existed. Rumor, now an official narrative, transformed into a political argument. It allowed repression to be presented as a necessary reaction rather than systemic violence. White archives reconstruct events, but black voices remain absent. No direct testimony from the insurgents has been preserved. This forced silence is one of the deepest marks in history. All we know of their motivations we deduce from contexts, conditions, and the master's reactions. The uprising thus appears as a desperate act, but also as a major political gesture, a moment when a group of men and women attempted to break free from the infernal cycle of fear and surveillance. When the insurgents were finally dispersed, the German coast attempted to revert to normalcy. But archives show that this normalcy no longer bore the same face. Masters were convinced they had escaped catastrophe. Authorities saw their power weakened by the scale of the uprising. Militias, exhausted, left reports that testified to latent trauma. The enslaved, for their part, lived with the consequences. Searches, interrogations, punishments, separations, impending executions. The January 1811 explosion reveals the immense gap between illusion and reality. It shows how a fear, inscribed in official documents, can be transformed into an interpretive tool, then into a justification for state violence. It also shows how an act of resistance, invisible in the archives, can emerge despite total surveillance. In this brutal transition, illusion ceased to be a myth. The dossier it had opened in December became, in January, the matrix of a narrative that would shape the German coast's memory for decades. This narrative, incomplete and biased, would be the one retained by official history, while the voices of the insurgents would continue to resonate only in the silences of the archive. Following the dispersal of the uprising, the German coast entered a phase that archives describe as a return to order. This administrative vocabulary masks a much darker reality. An exceptional judicial system was established, not to comprehend the events, but to transmute repressive violence into a legal spectacle. The trials that followed the January 1811 revolt were not trials in the judicial sense. They were expeditious procedures, organized to confirm authority, erase all ambiguity, and inscribe into the registers a singular narrative, that of an insurrection punished according to law. But this law, as it appears in the official records, was merely a facade. The special tribunals created to judge the insurgents lacked defense, independent investigators, or clear procedural rules. The minutes preserved in the archives show swift sessions, sometimes lasting only a few hours, where the accused were interrogated without the possibility of freely responding. The questions posed by the judges were leading, often based on suppositions or rumors collected in the preceding days. There is no voluntary testimony in these documents, only forced declarations, confessions obtained under conditions that are never described, but whose violent nature historians discern. The judges and planters comprising these tribunals constantly invoked the necessity of acting swiftly for the security of the population. This expression recurs in several official reports. It served to legitimize the absence of investigation, the acceleration of procedures, and the severity of sentences. Colonial justice aimed not to establish facts, but to produce a coherent narrative. The enslaved conspired. They acted under the influence of designated leaders. They threatened stability. They must be punished immediately. This coherence was imposed from improvised courtrooms, often in masters' homes or parish administrative buildings. The trials relied on internal testimonies, that is, on the declarations of owners and overseers. These testimonies were sometimes contradictory, but the judges did not seek to resolve such inconsistencies. They selected whatever confirmed the preconceived notion of a large, organized conspiracy. In a trial held in St. Charles, a master affirmed that the enslaved person he accused was always silent, which was suspicious. When asked for a precise example of subversive behavior, he replied, "I cannot provide one, but I sensed he was dangerous." This sentence is encoded in the minutes. The master's intuition became legal evidence. Confessions coerced from the accused are often fragmented, incoherent, at times impossible to interpret. Some claim to have followed a group without being able to name its members. Others asserted they were forced. Still, others remained silent. Archives show that silence, whatever its reason, was interpreted as an admission. Colonial justice read the absence of words as confirmation. In a St. Jean parish trial, the judge noted, "The accused does not deny his participation. He remains silent. That suffices." The sentence is written without comment. It perfectly summarizes the judicial logic of this period. In a system where the words of the enslaved held no legal value, silence is a trap. Sentences were pronounced immediately after interrogations, most often consisting of public executions, intended to re-establish white authority and efface any possibility of future resistance. Execution archives list names, approximate ages, and original estates. Sometimes a short note indicates the accused's presumed role: runaway, instigator, participant. No explanation is provided. These lists resemble inventories designed for quick consultation, devoid of details or nuances. They transform the insurgents into administrative objects. The trials had not only a punitive function, but also a narrative one. They allowed authorities to rewrite what had transpired. The Christmas rumor, vague and uncertain, was retrospectively interpreted as a clear preamble to the uprising. Judges affirmed that the signs were visible, that the insurrection had been heralded, that masters were right to be concerned. This narrative was inscribed in the minutes and confirmed in local newspapers, which published excerpts from the trials and insisted on the extreme dangerousness of the insurgents. The goal was to create a logical link between the fear of December and the violence of January. This link, though absent from documents prior to the uprising, became an official truth. The judicial spectacle extended to the execution sites. The bodies of the executed were sometimes publicly displayed, a practice inherited from French and Spanish colonial codes. This display is never described in the archives in terms of violence. It is presented as a necessary measure to deter any future enterprise. But oral testimonies collected in the 19th century evoke the profound trauma these spectacles inflicted upon black communities. Children forced to avert their gaze, women forbidden to weep, men compelled to witness in silence. Colonial justice utilized the bodies of the condemned as text, as evidence, as message. In the days following the trials, patrols continued, cabins were searched, families dispersed. The judicial system, which had already condemned, pursued its work of control. Planters continued to file complaints. Militiamen continued to write reports. The specter of the uprising became an argument for strengthening laws, hardening regulations, and further limiting avenues for movement and expression. Judicial repression did not mark the end of the event, but its institutional prolongation. In this sequence where everything appears ordered, controlled, encoded, one detail is striking: the disappearance of numerous documents. Some trial minutes are incomplete. Some pages are missing. Certain correspondences were burned or lost. This documentary void is an essential element of history. It indicates what the system wished to conceal: the absence of real evidence, the arbitrariness of decisions, the unacknowledged violence. White archives, whether intentionally or not, contain lacunae that speak more than the written lines. What ultimately remains is a staged justice, a justice that claimed rationality but rested on intuitions, fears, planters' pleas, and extorted confessions. A justice that spoke in the name of law but served an ideology. A justice that purported to be orderly, yet whose traces bear witness to the moral chaos of a slaveholding system willing to do anything to maintain itself. The trials of 1811 do not reveal the truth of the insurgents. They reveal the truth of power. A truth constructed, written, signed, but weakened by its own silences. And it is these silences that, more than the sentences, lend these archives their heaviest weight. When the expeditious trials of January 1811 concluded, the German coast resumed a semblance of normalcy. Plantations recommenced their activities. Boats once again plied the Mississippi. Local newspapers announced the restoration of tranquility. Yet, this calm was a fragile veneer. Beneath the surface, the event left profound imprints, invisible scars, fragmented memories, deliberately incomplete archives. The legacies of this period are not inscribed in a common narrative. They appear in fragments, as if history refused to be confined to the official version. A large portion of the archives related to the uprising vanished over the course of the 19th century. Some trial pages are missing, militia reports are untraceable, familial correspondences were burned or lost. Historians hesitate to categorize this phenomenon: administrative negligence, intentional destruction, or simply the erosion of time. But in all cases, the effect is the same. The native that remains is partial, unbalanced. One hears the voices of judges, masters, authorities. One hears almost nothing from the insurgents. Their silence, already imposed in the courtooms, extends into the present, though the lacunae of written memory. Yet, despite these absences, some traces endure. They are found in oral histories passed down through generations within black communities. These natives do not describe the exact chronology of events, but they preserve an emotion, fear, pain, but also the pride of having existed, even briefly, a system designed to stifle every possibility of freedom. In a testimony collected in the late 19th century, a descendant of enslaved people from the German coast spoke of a night when men rose, without being able to provide a precise date. The event has been transformed by memory, yet it lives on in these simple words. White memory, conversely, followed a different path. In some planter families, the uprising is recalled as a period of apprehension, a time when the territory almost succumbed to chaos. This version of events emphasizes the master's vigilance, the swiftness of justice, the necessity of the measures taken. The private archives that transmit this memory are marked by a desire to justify, to rationalize. They speak of order restored, of authority confirmed. They mention neither summary executions, nor shattered families, nor the human consequences of oppression. They illustrate another form of silence, a voluntary silence, constructed to maintain moral continuity. Between these two memories, official history hesitates. For a long time, the 1811 revolt was mentioned in books as a marginal episode, sometimes relegated to a footnote. Fragmentary archives, biased accounts, the absence of direct black sources complicate the work of historians. Some even doubt the true scale of the uprising. Others emphasize that the available documents are sufficient to understand the systemic nature of the violence that followed. The lack of traces does not erase the event. Rather, it reveals how a system can shape memory to its advantage. Over time, however, another reading emerged. Researchers, working on the region's scattered archives, rediscovered clues, fragments, names sometimes erased from registers. They reconstructed individual trajectories, illuminated areas of deliberate opacity. They demonstrated how the Christmas rumor became a narrative tool to justify oppression. They reminded us that official history is insufficient, that truth must also be sought in silences, in omissions, in documents that say nothing, but whose very absence carries meaning. The legacies of this period are also discernible in the geography. The places where the insurgents were captured, judged, executed, still exist, often without markers, without monuments, without visible trace. The cane fields have expanded, roads have changed, old houses have been replaced, but the territory retains a silent memory. The river, motionless in its bends, witnessed the passage of boats carrying militiamen and prisoners. Current plantations stand on lands where acts of resistance and extreme violence unfolded. The landscape itself is a silent witness. In contemporary black memory, the 1811 revolt sometimes appears as a symbol. It represents the idea that, even under the most oppressive conditions, a collective will can manifest. It recalls that freedom is not born of a decree or a law, but of a profound desire that survives chains, prohibitions, and trials. Many families do not know if their ancestors participated in the insurrection, but they know that something happened. This knowledge, however fragmented, carries a dignity that official archives have never recognized. What remains, finally, is a history with multiple voices, yet some voices are stifled, a history where the most complete documents convey only a fraction of reality, and where the heaviest silences carry the memory of the victims. The legacy of 1811 is not merely that of an uprising, it is that of a confrontation between a power that writes and lives that cannot write, between a justice that signs and bodies that vanish without a trace. In this final gaze upon the event, a question persists. How to account a history whose witnesses were not heard, whose archives were shaped by those who held force, and whose memory survives primarily in the lacunae of official documentation? This question, left open, continues to haunt the German coast. It reminds us that every history is also an absence, and that understanding the past requires listening not only to the words that were written, but also to those that are missing, those that were erased, and those that could never be uttered. Thus concludes the narrative. In the persistent silence of the archives and in the living memory of descendants who still seek to reconstruct what colonial violence attempted to efface,